we are going to start our next session, which is the first of a series of readings brought to us by folks who were invited to bring readings to us, called Light a Fire. And I'm excited to introduce to you curator, editor, based in Miami, co-founder of Name Press, Natalia Zuluaga, who will be sharing a selected reading with us. And this one is long, so tuck in. Take it away.
Thank you so much. First, can you all hear me or not yet? As long as this, there we go. Hi, yeah.
You got your water?
I've got water. And because I'm wireless, I might walk and get more. Well, first of all, before getting started, I wanted to thank Sarah, obviously, and the entire Art Papers team for inviting me here and for organizing such a meaningful but also emotional gathering. I too have a lot to thank Sarah for. We go way back to my own graduate experience where she encouraged a lot of my written voice early on. And so it's really nice to reconnect with her and all of these ideas here. I've co-run Name Publications now for over a decade, and the org is nearing its own 20th anniversary. So I say that today's reflections from the panel and from Sarah's own conversation reminded me of the importance of inflection points, and to think about how we do things and how we want to continue to do things. So I'm, in the immediate moment, very thankful for that. And I'm obviously very humbled to be here because this is a really incredible group of people that is both in this room and that are presenting. And I can't wait for everything that we're going to learn together. So really thank all of you in advance. All right. So today I'm going to be reading Reality Would Have to Begin by the German filmmaker and artist Harun Farocki. Farocki was known for essay films and video installations that critically examine the production and circulation of images. And he produced close to 120 films by the time of his death in 2014. Goodbye? Hello. As an editor and curator, I think I've been most preoccupied by the hope of developing, of sharpening, and returning to these ideas of visual and political literacy. And Farocki, for me, was a critical example of what that meant, and I returned to his work and to his writings often because of this. I, like many people, first came to his work through one of his early films called An Inextinguishable Fire, which he made in 1969. That film for me had the following haunting proposition. How can we show napalm in action? And how can we show you the injuries caused by napalm? If we show you the picture of napalm burns, you'll close your eyes. First, you'll close your eyes to the pictures, then you'll close your eyes to the memory, then you'll close your eyes to the facts, then you'll close your eyes to the entire context. He narrates this as he extinguishes a cigarette into his arm. And alongside this very impactful image, a narrative unfolds of the workers inside of a Dow chemical plant, the ways they justify their distance from the end product, and how their labor is highly specialized and fragmented from the whole for the same purpose. In this film, he sets up a film as diagram that he will follow throughout his entire career that illustrates the connection between the worker and the abstraction of their labor and the inseparable ties between photography and the atrocities of war. As a result, he beckons us to ask, and I think his text still does this, what does it mean for making and reading images? It's this diagrammatic approach that I find to be so useful. Even if the sites of atrocities change, if the photo apparatuses have evolved, and even as human agency, responsibility, and labor become further and further abstracted. Reality Would Have to Begin was published in Documents magazine in 1992, and I believe it was their first issue, and draws heavily from the script for his 1989 film called Images of the World and the Inscription of War. And I think of this text as a synthesis of the ideas that he presents in the film work. For those of you who don't know or maybe don't remember it, Documents was started in 1992 by Helen Molesworth, Mi-Wang Kwan, Margaret Sundell, Chris Hoover, and James Markovitz. The magazine was developed in a climate where journals like October, Art Forum, and Grey Room dominated discourse at that time. The founders wanted to create a publication that invested in artists and that, as Molesworth would later say, treated artists as equal practitioners in theory. And I return to Farocki for the same reasons. I think of his work as art that can theorize and reveal things that bring us closer to reality. So, one last note before I get started on the actual reading, or more reading. Like I said earlier, I do return to Farocki often, and I have thought about this text on and off for at least a decade, but I hadn't returned to read it in its entirety again until I received Sarah's invitation. I initially set out to read something lighter, because in this day and age, I kind of wanted something that maybe was a bit more uplifting, and maybe I was hungering for that, but that felt impossible, so. And as I reread it, the heavier I feel about what it has to say about images today, both about the seeming banality of images, of image making, image consumption, but of course about the acts of dehumanization we witness through images, and thus about what we see, and as he laid out for us in that early film in 1969, what we refuse to see and see ourselves in too. That being said, I want to mention that the text talks about concentration camps and the atrocities of war and death, and honestly, if you want a way out, I also reconsidered many times whether right now is the time I wanted to read this. So it's a trigger warning, but one that is meant generously. Because of time, I don't know how much time we'll have for discussion afterward, but I want to say I'm happy to open the space for conversations, for inquiries later, or really just for silence too, so we'll just get started. Reality would have to begin. Harun Farocki. In 1983, as preparations were underway to install even more nuclear weapons in the Federal Republic of Germany, Gunther Anders wrote, "Reality has to begin. This means that the blockade of the entrances to the murder installations, which continue to exist, must also be continuous. This idea is not new. It reminds me of an action, or rather a non-action, more than 40 years ago, when the Allies learned the truth about the extermination camps in Poland. The proposal was immediately made to block access to the camps, which meant bombing the railroad tracks leading to Auschwitz, Majdanek, etc. extensively in order to sabotage, through this blockade, the delivery of new victims, that is, the possibility of further murder," end quote. Nuclear weapons stationed in the Federal Republic of Germany arrive by ship in Bremerhaven, where they are put on trains whose departure time and destination are kept secret. About a week before departure, Army aircraft fly the entire length of the route and photograph it. This status report is repeated half an hour before the train is to pass, and the most recent set of images is compared with the first set. Through their juxtaposition, one can discern whether any significant changes have occurred in the interim. If, for example, a construction vehicle has recently been parked along the tracks, the police will drive or fly over to the spot to investigate whether it is providing camouflage for saboteurs. Whether such sabotage has been attempted is not made public. Reconnaissance of enemy territory by means of photographs taken from airplanes was already in use during World War I. And even before there were airplanes, balloons and rockets carrying cameras aloft and even carrier pigeons were outfitted with small cameras. In World War II, it was the English who were the first to begin equipping their bombers with photographic apparatus. Since they had to fly through enemy flak, anti-aircraft artillery fire, and enemy fighters, the bomber pilots always tried to drop their bomb load as quickly as possible. Often a third of the planes were lost in the flights from England to Germany. In their fear, the pilots believed all too readily that they had delivered their bombs on target. The introduction of cameras on board aircraft significantly diminished the space previously accorded to their oral reports. The English bomber pilots had the first workplace in which the camera was installed to monitor performance. Up to that point, men in war did work that was much less monitored and capable of being monitored than all industrial, commercial, or agricultural activity, since the object of their labor, enemy territory, was not under surveillance. In the case of the bomber pilot, The workers' perceptions and descriptions still counted for something. Photographs would destroy this last remaining sense of authority. A photographic image is a cut, a section through the bundle of light rays that reflected off objects in a circumscribed space. Photography reproduces the three-dimensional object on a flat plane based on the laws of projective geometry. In 1858, it occurred to Albrecht Meydenbauer, the director of the government building office, to make use of this optical principle and to think of photographs as images for scale measurement. Faced with the task of measuring the facade of the cathedral at Wetzlar, he traversed the length of the facade in a basket suspended from a block and tackle in the same way that window washers do, in order to avoid the expense of erecting scaffolding. One evening, in order to save time, he tried to climb from the basket into a window of the tower when the basket swung away from the facade and put him in danger of plummeting to the ground. Quote, "In the nick of time, I grabbed the curved edge of an arc with my right hand, and with my left foot, I kicked the basket far into the air. The counteraction sufficed to push my body into the opening, and I was saved. As I came down, the thought occurred to me, is it not possible to replace measurement by hand by the reversal of the perspective of seeing which is captured in a photographic image? This thought, which limited the personal difficulty and danger involved in measuring buildings, was father to the technique of scale measurement," end quote. Meydenbauer often repeated this story from the 19th century. It is a narrative of endangerment and redemptive insight. The hero is in the process of making a construction into a calculation. Is engaged in the labor of abstraction, at which point the measured space wants one more to prove its actuality. The greatest danger is posed by the objectivity and actuality of things. It is dangerous to remain physically near the object, to linger at the scene. One is much safer if one takes a picture and evaluates it later at one's desk. Immediately following the initial publication of Meydenbauer's idea, the military, an organization with many desks, offered to cover the cost of a practical experiment, but this could not be undertaken right away, as there was a war at the time. The first scale measurement based on photographs took place in 1868 at the fortress of Saarlouis. The military immediately recognized in the technique of photographic scale measurements the possibility of capturing objects and spaces at distance, numerically spaces which soldiers otherwise could only traverse and measure at the risk of life and limb. The military took Meydenbauer's formulation of death or measurement literally. The first image taken by the Allies of the concentration camp at Auschwitz was shot on April 4, 1944. American planes had taken off from Foggia, Italy, heading toward targets in Silesia, factories for extracting gasoline from coal, gasoline hydrogenation, and for producing Buna, synthetic rubber. While approaching the IG Farben complex, still under construction, an airman turned on the camera and took a series of 22 aerial photographs, 3 of which also captured the main camp located in the vicinity of the industrial plants. These images, along with others, arrived at the Center for Aerial Photography Analysis in Medmenham, England. The analysts identified the industrial complexes pictured, recorded in their reports the state of their construction and the degree of their destruction, and made estimates on the production capacities of the Buna plants. They did not mention the existence of the camps. Again and again, even in 1945, after the Nazis had cleared out the Auschwitz camps, having dismantled some of the murder complexes and either killed, abandoned, or transferred the prisoners to camps in the West, Allied airplanes flew over Auschwitz and captured the camps in photographs. They were never mentioned in a report. The analysts had no orders to look for the camps, and therefore did not find them. It was a success of the television series Holocaust, a program that tried to make suffering and dying imaginable through visual narratives, thereby turning it into kitsch, that gave 2 CIA employees the idea of looking for aerial photographs of Auschwitz. They fed the geographic coordinates of all camps that were located in the vicinity of bombing targets into the CIA computer, and thus also those of the IG Farben factory in Monowitz. IG Farben had built large plants in Monowitz and allowed the SS to provide them with slave laborers. For a time, they operated a camp located immediately adjacent to the factory grounds. Here, Jewish prisoners from across Europe, prisoners of war primarily from the Soviet Union, and others who had been declared enemies of the Reich were worked to death. Sometimes 1/7 or 30 out of 200 of a particular group perished in one day. those who did not die from overwork or undernourishment, and those who were not beaten to death by the SS or Krapos, soon became too weak to work and were transferred to Birkenau, the extermination camp. The IG Farben-Monowitz factories served the aircraft industry and consequently were of strategic interest to the Allies, which is what attracted the bombers and cameras and later helped to lead the rediscovery of the images. 33 years after the pictures were shot, those two CIA men undertook new analysis of the images. In the first image from April 4th, 1944, they identified the house of Auschwitz's commandant and marked the wall between blocks 10 and 11 where executions regularly took place. They also identified and marked the gas chambers of Auschwitz I and wrote, "A small vehicle was identified in a specially secured annex adjacent to the main gas chamber." Eyewitness accounts describe how prisoners arriving in Auschwitz-Birkenau, not knowing they were destined for extermination, were comforted by the presence of a Red Cross ambulance. In reality, the SS used the vehicle to transport the deadly Zyklon B crystals. Could this be that notorious vehicle? End quote. The analysts are not entirely certain since, while they are able, at a distance of 7,000 meters, to make out the spot as a vehicle, they can establish neither the type of vehicle it is, nor discern any markings on it. What distinguishes Auschwitz from other places cannot be immediately observed from those images. We only recognize in these images what others have already testified to, eyewitnesses who were physically present at the site. Once again, there is an interplay between image and text in the writing of history. Texts that should make images accessible, and images that should make texts imaginable. On the night of April 9th, we suddenly heard the distant rumble of heavy aircraft, something which we had never known all the time we had been in Auschwitz. Was the secret out? Were high explosives going to rip away the high tension wires and the watchtowers and the guards with their dogs? Was this the end of Auschwitz? The two prisoners listening for the sounds of aircraft on April 9th were attempting to escape from Auschwitz. One of them, Rudolf Verba, then 19 years old, had already been in the camp for 2 years. First, working on the construction of the Buna factory, and later in the effects detachment. When a train with deportees arrived at the camp, the new arrivals had to have their possessions dropped in by air, which were collected and sorted by a special detail, a Sonderkommando. The Nazis called these possessions effects, and among them, Verba found food which helped him to sustain his strength and stay alive. The other prisoner, Alfred Wetzler, like Verba, a Jew from Slovakia, worked in the camp's administrative office. There, he committed to memory the arrival dates, places of origin, and the number of deportees newly arrived at the camp. And since he was in contact with the men in the special details forced to work at the gas chambers and the crematoria, he also learned the statistics of those murdered and memorized long lists of numbers. Verba and Wetzler decided to flee when it became clear to them that the resistance groups in the camp would not be able to revolt, but could at best fight for their own survival. They wanted to flee because they could not imagine that the existence of the camp was known to the Polish resistance and the Allies. Verba was convinced that Auschwitz was possible only because the victims who came to Auschwitz didn't know what was happening there. Some may find it hard to believe, but experience has proven that one can see not everything, but many things, better in the scale measurement than on the spot, wrote Meydenbauer in a text in which she sought to lay the groundwork for the historic preservation of archives. Again, he describes how unnecessary a long stay at the site was, even for the purpose of measurement. At this mentality and physically strenuous occupation, the architect is exposed to the weather, sunshine, or rainfall on his sketchbook, and when he looks up, dust in his eyes, end quote. In these passages, a horror of the objectivity of the world is noticeable. Meydenbauer's meditation gave rise in 1885 to the foundation of the Royal Prussian Institute of Scale Measurement, the world's first. The military took up the idea of measuring from photographs as did the historic preservationists of monuments. The former destroys while the latter preserves. Since 1972, the UNESCO Convention concerning the protection of the world's cultural and national heritage obligates all member states to document special buildings photographically. Using these archived photographs, one ought to be able to read and calculate the building's floor plan in the case of its destruction, a destruction already conceived in these protective measures. The mathematical artists of the Renaissance stretched transparent papers in frames and traced on the plane the outlines of the spatial objects shining through. With the invention of photography, these founders of the perspectival method seemed to be the precursors of photographers. With the invention of scale measurement, they seem to be early scale measurement engineers. Erwin Panofsky wrote that one could understand perspective observation both in terms of ratio and objectivism, and in terms of chance and subjectivism. It is an ordering, but an order of the visual phenomenon. If one considers an image as a measuring device, then one should ignore chance and subjectivity. To conceive of a photographic image as a measuring device is to insist on the mathematicality, the calculability, and finally, the computability of the image world. Photography is first of all analog technology. A photographic image is an impression of the original, an impression at a distance made with the help of optics and chemistry. Wilhelm Flusser had remarked that digital technology has already found an embryonic form in photography. Hello? Because the photographic image is built up out of dots and decomposes into dots. The human eye synthesizes these dots of information into an image. A machine can capture the same image without any consciousness or experience of the form by situating the image points in a coordinate system. The continuous sign system image thereby becomes divisible into discrete units, and it can be transmitted and reproduced. A code is thus obtained that comprehends images. This leads one to activate the code and to create new images out of this code language. Images without originals become possible, and hence generated images. Verba and Wetzler hid themselves outside the high voltage fence around the camp under a pile of boards they had doused with a mix of tobacco and petroleum. An experienced fellow prisoner had advised them to do so because this would keep the tracker dogs at bay. After 3 days, the SS gave up their search and reported the escape of both men in a telegram addressed to Himmler. This indicates the extent to which they must have feared the eyewitness account from concentration camps. Verba and Wetzler made it to the Slovakian border by marching at night, crossed it, and made contact with the Jewish council in the city of Žilina. Over the next days, they reported on the death camp at Auschwitz. They drew the ground plan of the complexes and recounted the list of statistics of the people delivered and murdered. What they reported, they had to reconfirm time and time again as they were cross-examined and with questions rephrased. The Jewish Council wanted conclusive, irrefutable material in order to prove to the world the barely believable crime. The unimaginable was repeated to make it imaginable. 3 copies of the Verba-Wetzler report were drawn up and sent out. The first was to go to Palestine. It was sent to Istanbul, but it never arrived since the courier was probably a spy paid by the Nazis. The second copy was sent to a rabbi who had contacts in Switzerland and reached London via Switzerland. The British government passed the report on to Washington. A third copy was sent to the papal nuncio and arrived in Rome approximately 5 months later. When Verba and Wetzler fled in April, the deportation and murder of about 1 million Hungarian Jews was imminent. It was only in July of 1944 that the Horthy government stopped handing over Hungarian Jews to the Germans, as the Red Army was approaching and the war was on the verge of being lost. Horthy sought an arrangement with the West, which now had accurate knowledge of Auschwitz, and demanded, through diplomatic channels, an end to the mass extermination. Verba and Wetzler's report thus helped save hundreds of thousands of lives. On June 25th and 27th, the Manchester Guardian reported on the Nazi death factory for the first time mentioned the place's name, Auschwitz. Excuse my pronunciation. The mass extermination of the Jews by the Nazis was now occasionally mentioned in the newspaper, however only among the many stories of dramatic war events, as news that soon disappeared into oblivion. A year later, when the Germans had lost the war and the concentration camps were liberated, the Allies photographed and filmed the camps, the survivors and the traces that pointed to the millions murdered. It was above all the images of piles of shoes, glasses, false teeth, the mountains of shorn hair that made such a profound impression. Perhaps we need images so that something that is hardly imaginable can register. Photographic images as the impressions of the actual at a distance. Nazis, in fact, also took photographs in Auschwitz. When Lily Jacob, who had been transferred from Auschwitz to the Silesian munitions factories and from there to Dora Nordhausen camp, was looking for warm clothes in the guards' quarters after the liberation, she found an album with 206 photographs. In the pictures, she recognized herself and members of her family who had not survived. Photography was forbidden in Auschwitz, but apparently 2 SS men were charged with documenting the camp. They captured the sorting or selection procedure in one comprehensive high-angle shot. And I'm just pausing here to say that this version of the text that I have in my book doesn't have the images themselves, and I have them in a different version on a PDF. I was gonna scroll through them, but Farocki does such a detailed job of describing these images. I'm happy to show them after I have them on my computer, but it's just to say I wasn't doing it intentionally to block it out, but to just continue with the reading. They captured the sorting or selection procedure in one comprehensive high-angle shot. In the foreground, we see men in SS uniforms. Behind them, newly arrived deportees in 2 columns. Seen from the camera's perspective, men and women up to roughly the age of 40 are standing on the left, wearing lighter colored clothes, and on the right are the older ones, women with children and all of those too sick or too weak to work. Those standing on the right will be taken immediately to the gas chamber. Those standing on the left will undergo the admission procedure. They will be tattooed, they will be shaved bald, and they will be assigned work that is also a form of extermination, which delays death and prolongs dying. Once the authorities started taking photographs, everything had to be captured in images. Even the crimes they themselves committed were documented visually. A mountain of images rises alongside a mountain of files. An image from this album. A woman has arrived at Auschwitz, and the camera captures her in the act of looking back as she walks by. On her left, an SS man holds an old man, also recently arrived at Auschwitz, by the lapels of his jacket with his right hand, a gesture of sorting. In the center of the image, the woman. The photographers always point their cameras at the beautiful women. Or after they have set up their camera somewhere, they take a picture when a woman they consider beautiful passes by. Here on the platform at Auschwitz, they photograph a woman the way that they would cast a glance at her in the street. The woman knows how to take in this photographic gaze with the expression on her face and how to look ever so slightly past the viewer. And just this way, on a boulevard, she would look past the gentleman casting a glance at her in a store window. She shows that she does not respond to the gaze, but is aware of being looked at. With the gaze, she transplants herself into a different place, a place with boulevards, gentlemen, shop windows, far from here. The camp run by the SS is meant to destroy her, and the photographer who captures her beauty for posterity is part of that same SS. How the 2 elements interact, destruction and preservation. This is how we get an image like this, an image that fits well with the story of the Nazis spread about the deportation of the Jews. They said the Jews would arrive in a kind of large ghetto, a kind of colony, a place somewhere in Poland. The Nazis did not make even these images public, since they deemed it more appropriate to withhold everything that pointed to the actuality of the extermination camps. It was more useful to allow the place somewhere in Poland to remain uncertain. The structure of the album Lily Jacob found follows the ordering principles of the camp. It classifies the people in the camp according to the designations: still able-bodied men, no longer able-bodied men, still able-bodied women, no longer able-bodied women. In their anticipated post-war future, the Nazis could have displayed these images, while here in the camp, there would be not a single kick, not a single dead person to be seen. The extermination of the Jews would have the appearance of an administrative measure. Verba and Wetzler's report was not the first news of the extermination of the Jews in camps and death factories, but due to the precision of details about places and numbers, it had a much greater impact than those that had preceded it. In its wake, Jewish functionaries repeatedly appealed to London and Washington for air raids to destroy the train tracks leading to Auschwitz. Yitzhak Gruenbaum of the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem telegraphed Washington, suggests deportation would be much impeded if railways between Hungary and Poland could be bombed. Benjamin Axon of the US government's War Refugee Board advocated bombing the gas chambers and crematoria themselves, as this would constitute the most tangible and perhaps the only tangible evidence of the indignation aroused by the existence of these charnel houses. Presumably, a large number of Jews in these camps may be killed in the course of these bombings, though some of them may escape in the confusion. But these Jews are doomed to death anyhow. The destruction of the camps would not change their fate, but it would serve retribution against their murders, and it might save their lives of future victims, end quote. In fact, had the gas chambers and crematoria been destroyed in 1944, the Nazis could no longer have rebuilt them. The military and political leaders of England and the US refused, however, to attack the access routes to the camps or the extermination installations themselves. They let the pleas, suggestions, petitions, and demands circulate for a long time internally, and then justified their refusal with the argument that they could not afford to divert their forces. The conclusion was that the only way to help the Jews would be a military victory over Germany. When on August 25, 1944, American planes once more flew over Auschwitz, one of them again took pictures from which we noticed that a train has just arrived. One of its freight cars can be identified near the left edge of the image. A group of deportees is walking along the tracks toward the gas chambers at Crematorium Complex 2, where the entrance gate is open. Behind the gate, a decorative flower bed, landscaping, a courtyard, and building are meant to convey the impression that this is a hospital or a sanatorium. Over the flower bed, a flat building, barely recognizable through the shadow of its front wall, undressing room. In this room, the arrivals were told to undress in preparation for showering. Diagonally across the room are the gas chambers. The details are meant to simulate a shower room. It would hold up to 2,000 people who were often forced in violently. Then the SS would lock the doors. 4 openings can be spotted on the roof, vents. It was through these openings that, after a short waiting period to allow the temperature in the gas chamber to rise, SS men in gas masks dropped the Zyklon B pellets. Everyone in the gas chamber died within 3 minutes. Others, who did not have to go to their deaths immediately, can be seen here waiting in line being registered. They are waiting to be tattooed, to have their heads shaved, and assigned work and a place to sleep. The doubly carved figure of their waiting line extends all the way to the trees on the lower right. The Nazis did not notice that someone had taken note of their crimes, and the Americans did not notice that they had captured them on film. The victims also failed to notice, notes that seemed to be written into God's book alone. Meidenbauer's fear of death established departments and administrative authorities that began to process images. Today, one speaks of image processing when machines are programmed to screen and classify photographs according to given criteria. A satellite continuously takes pictures of a specific region. A computer program examines all the images to determine whether their details betray differences with earlier images. Another machine examines all the sequential images to detect traces of moving vehicles, and yet another is programmed to recognize any forms that may indicate a rocket silo. This is called image processing. Machines are supposed to evaluate images made by machines. The Nazis talked about the eradication of cities, which means the suspension of their symbolic existence on the map. Verba and Wetzler wanted to put the names Auschwitz on the map. At that time, images of the Auschwitz death factory already existed, but no one yet had evaluated them. In the fall of 1944, Jewish women who worked at a munitions factory inside the camp's underground managed to smuggle small amounts of explosives to members of the camp's underground. The material was relayed to male prisoners who worked in the gas chamber and crematoria area. Those few wretched Jews then attempted what the Allied powers, with their vast might, would not. On October 7th, in a suicidal uprising, they blew up one of the crematorium buildings. None of the insurgents survived. An aerial photograph displays the partial destruction of Crematorium 4. That's how I felt after too. Yeah. I don't have a lot to open with after that, only to say that the text is now, 1992 originally published. Most of it was probably written in 1989, and for me, it just feels like it's still, like it helps me read so much of what we see today. And so when I was invited to do this, I really wanted to think about things that like maybe they weren't new models necessarily, right? Like I wasn't trying to think about where things were going, but things that, maybe writing that helped me keep going. And so that's my only really concluding thought. Does anybody need anything? It's actually perfect time. Oh, yes.
You probably just said, could you clarify of all the... You probably might have just explained it, I'm sorry if you have, but
No.
Could you clarify of all the texts that Farocki has written, is known for, why you specifically chose that text?
Yeah. I think because I remember when I first read it, how taken aback I was by this idea that like even when things are documented and even when things are like in an image, like this idea that you're not, that these soldiers are not ordered to see something or to look for something and therefore they do not see, that really just stuck with me for a long time. And so I think about like the way in which we consume images on the day to day and like the construction of images. Like I think about, for example, his film An Image, where he's documenting and following this photo shoot for Playboy. And I think about like that very careful making of an image, that I thought this text did that. It reminded me of like the things that like we think photography reveals to us a big reality of things, but in fact like we really have to look much more carefully, right? Or like it demands another form of seeing and reading and literacy that like maybe we don't sit with often enough. So that's why I chose this text.
I have a question in talking about the power of images in this context of war and genocide. And you're talking about, I hear the power of finally seeing and having to really look. Sometimes these images don't show everything. And when I hear about this, I think of our current moment that we've been seeing for 2 years and then years before that of what's happening in Palestine. And we're seeing those images on our phone every single day. We're seeing it from hundreds of people's perspectives who are there, and we, as clearly as we possibly could. And I don't think this is a question that you can answer or that I'm looking for you to answer. But when I think about images and I think about their power in mobilizing people, what does that look like in our modern world? Because we're getting as clear of a picture as we could possibly get, and it's not enough. It's not enough to make the whole world be willing, the whole world, I mean, the United States, Israel, to recognize the humanity of an entire people. And I don't want to say that takes my confidence in art and imagery away, but I don't know, I don't have an answer. I don't understand why the images is not enough sometimes still. And what is the role of images now then in the context of this exact thing happening and repeating itself directly to a people that are actually really linked to the first people that this happened to in this particular context?
I don't have an answer, you're right, and I just feel similarly. I think, like I mentioned earlier, again, and what is the role of images now? I don't have an answer. Honestly, I think it's just a question that sites are good to contemplate and to sit with the discomfort of, right? But yeah, it's precisely that.